is a graphic design grid? A grid you might think of as graph paper or lots of lines on a page dividing things up into small segments, but in graphic design, a grid is basically an organizational system that you use to help organize elements on your page and maintain unity and consistency. There are different kinds of grids and different ways of using them, and here we're going to take a look at a website that shows some of the examples of grids you can use and also the importance of deciding upon a grid at the beginning of your project and sticking to it as you place your design elements. So here I have a website called designersinsights.com. It's worth a look through to look at the different options that it has, but this page covers, I think, the idea of layout grids in a very simple and easy to understand way. And they mentioned that there are two main kinds of layouts, vertical or landscape. Now I'd like to expand on that a little bit. Vertical is also known as portrait, so if you see the term portrait you'll know that it's vertical. And the term landscape also means horizontal. So portrait and landscape, vertical and horizontal. So there are two basic kinds of pages that you work on. If you're working in print, you'll very often be working on vertical pages and layouts. If you're doing work for the screen, such as for websites or other screen-based applications, you'll probably be more concerned with a horizontal layout. So there are different kinds of grids that exist to help you organize your pages. And generally, in graphic design, grids are referred to by the number of columns that they utilize. Okay, they're not broken up as much into horizontal rows as they are into vertical columns. So here we have examples of 6 vertical pages using different kinds of grids. The one column grid fills the page with it fills the margins with imagery and graphic elements. 2 columns divides it into 2 columns. Now these columns don't always have to be the same width. That's something that's good to remember. These examples do show equal width columns, but columns do not have to be equal as long as there is a certain consistency throughout, say, a multi-page document. If you have one wide column and a narrower one on one page, it would be good to repeat that setup on the subsequent pages, again for consistency. So we have 2 different versions of the 2-column grid here, and then we have 3 versions of the 3-column grid down here on the bottom row. Now I recommend, generally speaking, that a 2 or a 3-column grid is the best way to go. It breaks up the space such that you can utilize it in many different ways. It will maintain the best readability for text, and it's really very versatile. Now here's the idea about a grid. You want to adhere to it with your text and with headlines, with imagery, but then you can break out of it now and then for visual appeal. Look at this example down here, this one. The gray squares, which indicate imagery, they span a couple of columns, and this one goes to the edge of the page. It bleeds off. This one spans 2 columns. The text itself maintains the 3-column grid. So we have a nice balance of 2 and 3-column spanning here with imagery and text. And you'll notice that the headline of this example goes across all 3 of the columns without regard for the columns themselves. So that's breaking out a little bit, but it still all works together. And you'll notice that in all of these cases, with the exception of this bleeding off here and the silhouette of the woman, in every case the outside margins are honored. Okay, there's a little bit of breakout here, but that's good because this is an image of a skateboarder and it wants to break out a little bit. So the idea of grid use is you adhere to those guidelines with the important pieces, and then you make conscious decisions about when to break out of the grid. So that's the basic idea, and that takes a little bit of practice and experience with laying out pages, but that underlying grid, which of course is invisible once things are printed or published, the underlying grid will help you as you get your skills and get your kind of your chops in order with graphic design. and it will prove to be a really helpful way for you to get comfortable with this concept. The next section here are landscape grids. These are the horizontal pages, and we're doing more of these now with website design and screen-based design. One word here about design for mobile apps. This is becoming much more of a graphic design skill because so many of us are using websites and screen-based apps on our phones. So the layout here isn't quite the same, and there are no examples of real grid use for mobile applications yet, but they're being developed, and they are probably one column based and very simple and easy to read because of course the screens are so much smaller. But let's say that we had the luxury of a whole big website screen to work with. The 2-column and the 3-column are very common here as well. We start to see more evidences of 4-column grids because we have such a wide screen to work with. The same principles apply. You honor the grid, but then you break out of it occasionally, maintaining readability at all times, bleeding off the edge when appropriate. One thing I don't recommend is using a 1-column grid, particularly with a landscape screen, because the line length of the text becomes really hard to read. It's too long, it's too much. People do it, but I don't recommend it. It's far better to go with a 2 or a 3-column grid. And again, if you have the information, you can successfully go with a 4-column grid. Again, this will take practice, and you will learn in time which is going to work best for your purposes. Further down on this page, here's a section about, this is specifically for printing. If you're working on a book that's going to be bound, here's a nice looking side view graphic of a perfect bound book. And you'll see that you lose some of your pages in the binding because of the way that it's put together. And this area here is known as the gutter of your page. So when your pages are laid out, you always want to keep in mind that you're going to lose a little bit of your page into the gutter, and you have to adjust your elements accordingly. You don't want to run text beyond the margin. If you want to have a photograph that bleeds across 2 pages, you're going to have to carefully crop it and place it such that it reads correctly when the book is opened. And professional printers know how to work with this. They know how to achieve that effect given their gutter width. So if you ever have to work with professional printers and come across a scenario like this, just be aware of the gutter and work with them to make sure your pieces come out correctly. Down here on this page, we have something that is somewhat related to grids, although not exactly. Really good to study the rule of thirds, which is a way of breaking up imagery into 9 squares or 9 sections and placing your elements of interest not dead center. They're more interesting if they're placed a little bit off to the side. You'll notice that the focal points here are placed at an intersection of the 9 block layout here. Much more interesting than if these things were dead center. And for those of you interested in mathematics and algebra, the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence are mathematical and geometric they are theories of visual balance, and I'm not going to go into it here. It's actually quite heavily mathematical, but the concepts of these golden spiral and Fibonacci sequences relate to visual balance too. So you might want to do research on these particular topics to learn more about this interesting concept here. And lastly, we remind you, this website reminds us to always start your design project with a grid. You really want to have that underlying structure, that underlying system set up so that you can be consistent across multiple pages and to have visual unity throughout your piece. Another reason to have a grid is sometimes you might be working with a team of designers. There might be other people working on the same project, and with an underlying grid, it's much more likely that the work that you produce together is going to be unified rather than having all different looks for a piece. Okay, so the grids are an honored and successful and reliable system for organizing your work for both typography work and imagery and all your graphic elements. Understanding the different kinds of grids and knowing how to work with them comfortably will be one of the things that will make you into a stellar graphic designer. So good luck with your explorations and enjoy learning and working with grids. Thanks.